We're going to look at a story from a guy named Matthew, one of Jesus' followers, a guy that was a tax collector, records, and it's towards the end of Jesus' ministry. He's been, out public speaking. He's been healing people. He's been teaching people. He's been traveling around for close to 3 years at this point. And Matthew tells about a specific instance that happens. In fact, here's how he begins in chapter 15 of what we call the Gospel of Matthew. Some Pharisees and teachers of the law, some scribes, came to Jesus from Jerusalem. And when Matthew writes those words, they came from Jerusalem, it's sort of code word, right? It's code word that they were up to something and they were after something. They didn't just show up. It's sort of like you ever had somebody show up from headquarters for the main office at your place and you're like, wonder what they're doing here? And they just stopped by to see how things are going. And you're like, oh, no, they didn't, right? You kind of think they're looking for something, right? That's kind of what the experience. You ever had anybody show up at your office, show up at your classroom, and then like, hey, we're just kind of checking to see how you're doing, and it's like, no, you aren't sure, right? That's the feeling that Matthew gets when this particular group of people, of men, because they're always men, when they show up. And here's when they show up, they right away find Jesus, and Jesus has always got a crowd around him at this stage of his ministry. And when he shows up, they get in front of Jesus and in front of the crowd, and here's what they ask him. They ask Jesus this question: why don't your followers, why don't your disciples obey the traditions of the elders? This unwritten laws which have been handed down to us. Why? And this was a question not just about Jesus' disciples, his followers. This was about a question about Jesus, because this was questioning his leadership. Because these are your followers, Jesus. And look at what they're doing. Why don't they follow the tradition of the elders? And if you go do a little bit of quick research, you'll discover that the tradition of elders is this almost mystical teaching within Judaism. And it's been around for a long, long time. In fact, it's also known as the oral Torah. And here's how it goes. Here's how if I understand it correctly, how it works. They believe that Moses went up on Mount Sinai. He got, the 10 Commandments directly written by God. And he also got 613 other laws that he came down and wrote down. And that's what we have in our Bible. We have the 10 Commandments, and then you also have 613 other commandments. They're divided, not 50-50, but almost close to 50-50, where it's like, half of them are don't do this, and the other half are do this, right? But they also have this belief that Moses came down with a whole bunch of extra laws that he didn't write down. Why didn't he write them down? That's a really good question that I could not find any answer to. It seems like, he's already written down 10 and 613. He's written down 600. He didn't write down. God wrote down 10. He writes down 613 of them. Couldn't he take some time to write down the rest of them? But no, it was this belief that this oral Torah, this oral law that was equally authoritative in their life was passed along from man to man, because it's always a group of men, right? Passing it down through time. And this men sort of controlled this, right? They controlled the teaching. And the teaching was the idea of how do we sort of protect the other laws, right? And when we looked at these a few weeks ago about the Sabbath laws, right? These different categories, and we look at them and think, wow, how minute are they, right? How detailed are they? How they kind of talk about stuff that doesn't seem to make any kind of sense to us. But it was the idea that they were trying to protect something. And they begin to use this tradition. Because if you've been around any place that has traditions are, they're like walls, right? And the longer traditions go on, the more they grew up to become the belief. And I'm not saying traditions are bad. They're just bad when they become all about the tradition and not what is behind it all. So here's the tradition of the elders that this group from Jerusalem have just come to check out and ask Jesus some questions about. Why don't your followers follow the traditions of the elders? Here's the one that they were really torqued about on that particular day. They said, your guys don't wash their hands before they eat. To which we go, so? Let's be honest, most of us don't wash our hands before we eat, right? Some of you do. When you were a kid, your mom would always tell you to wash your hands before you eat because you're not playing inside. But as you get older, it's like, I don't have time to wash my hands. I didn't touch anything terrible, so I'm good, right? I didn't get my hands too dirty today, so I can eat. But this was their big thing. And this was this idea of that for them, faith was all about not breaking God's law. That was the totality of faith. Faith wasn't about a relationship with God, a response to God. It was just that God, we don't want to break his laws. We're about not offending God. We don't want to offend God. And so not to offend God, we have to not break his law. And not to break his law, we need to have some other laws to prevent us from even getting close to breaking that law. And this teaching was, you had to wash your hands, from your elbows down, get them clean before you ate anything, because you didn't want any chance for any little speck of dirt, any little bug that might, somehow landed on your arm when you ate, and somehow, you opened your mouth to eat and it got in your mouth. Oh, that's terrible. And so this was this whole tradition of you had to wash before you ate in order to protect yourself from offending God. Now the problem with these non-written laws is they made God very petty and very small. They made God worried about all the little details, and they built these things up into this tradition where it just became the ritual. This is what we did all the time in order to not offend God. And so they've come and they are worked up over what's going on with Jesus and his disciples. And they ask this question, why are you guys breaking the tradition of why are they not washing their hands before they eat? And I want you to notice how Matthew remembers Jesus responding. Because Jesus isn't like in fact, let's just get to it. Here's how Jesus answers. He doesn't kind of really answer the question. In fact, he goes in a whole different direction. You asked me this question? Let me ask you a question, right? And why? Because they've said, why don't you guys wash their hands? And why? And why do you refuse to obey? Why do you violate God's command for the sake of your traditions? Why do you block over what's clear with these traditions that pop up? Why do you say, here's what God says, but we say, the traditional elders say something else, and we always go with something else over that? Why do you do this for the sake of why do you violate? And when Jesus says this offends the Pharisees and the scribes, right? These teachers of the law, because this is like, how dare you accuse us of violating God's law when we're upholding God's law? Then Jesus goes right for the throat. He says, listen, God said, Moses said, God said, honor your father and your mother. One of the big 10, right? Number 5. God said that. And, by the way, he said more. God also said, anyone who says cruel things, who speaks evil of or curses his father or mother must be put to death, which I thought was very appropriate on Mother's Day weekend. So boys and girls, pay attention, right? But Jesus goes hard at them, right? He isn't like kind of playing with them. He isn't playing with them at all. He just says, hey, you want to go this way? Let's do this, right? Why are you violating God's law? The thing that God himself actually said and actually wrote down himself, and then also the other part that he passed down to Moses to write down for you. And this is clear, and this is harsh, right? Don't mess with mom and dad, or bad stuff could happen. But he says, listen, you say a person can tell his father or mother this: Mom, Dad, I have something I could use to help you, right? In your old age, you're struggling. I have some funds I could use to help you, but Mom and Dad used to be so proud of me as your religious child that I have given, I've dedicated, I've devoted it, all that I can help you with, to God already. Love to help Mom and Dad, but you know how you taught me to be devoted to God. And so I've devoted it all to God, and sorry, you're out of luck. And Jesus looks at them and says, you teach that person not to honor his father and mother. In other words, you have taught them to break one of the commandments by your own traditions. In fact, you have rejected, you've invalidated, you've canceled what God said. You've canceled the word of God for the sake of your tradition. You have let your tradition build up to where it's become the big thing and missed the really big thing. In fact, Jesus points out their duplicity in using extra non-biblical stuff to override biblical stuff. I was tempted to go really deep on that today, but I'm hoping some of you are thinking, at this moment. And if it's gone over your head a little bit, that's probably a good thing for you, but I want you just to kind of pause on that, right? When we build up these traditions, these beliefs, these practices that become the way things are. In fact, I'll just give you, let's wade into it a little bit, not too deep, but a little bit today. If you've ever been around another Adventist church, you've probably had the wonderful experience of having a meal served at that church. And if you had a meal served at that church, it's almost guaranteed to be a vegetarian meal. And the reason is because that's our tradition. We eat vegetarian meals there. And the question of why, it's healthier, but if you've ever been at what they call potluck, right, where everybody just kind of brings, anything that doesn't have meat in it, it's not really healthier, right? And the crazy thing is, the majority of people who are eating that meal are not vegetarians. But it's the tradition of the elders, right? It's our tradition. And in some places, it's a hard tradition to break. In fact, you don't want to try to break it because how dare you? You're messing with these pieces. Now, I could go more, but I'm going to stop right there because I like. But I want you to think about that. Now, Jesus points to them out their duplicity and using extra non-biblical stuff to override biblical stuff. This is what the Bible says, but somebody else says this, so there we are. Now I'm going to stop. All right, let's get back to Jesus. Bail me out, Jesus. Here we are. So Jesus keeps at it. He's like he just presses the pedal to the floor and just is going as fast as this will go. He's not stopping. He's not giving them a chance to respond. He's just bringing it all on. In fact, he goes, listen, you guys are a bunch of hypocrites. Which is nobody wants to be called a hypocrite, right? But he calls them out in front of all this crowd. You hypocrites. Isaiah was right about you 700 years ago, well before you were born. Isaiah prophesied about you. He said, hey, there's this group of people that are going to be this, and he's talking about you, which really offends them. But Jesus says, let me just tell you what Isaiah wrote about you 700 years ago. He said, oh, these people, you people, show honor to me with words. You sound so good, right? But their hearts are far from me. They've just got stuck in their traditions and rituals, believing that if they just do their traditions and rituals, everything will be good. That their faith, their religious experience is based on those traditions and rituals. And he says, all they've done is create a wall between you and me. Their worship of me, again, your worship of God is worthless. It's in vain. It has no redeeming quality to it. Which they're like pushing back. No, our traditions have redeeming quality, right? These have been passed down for generations at this point, like 1,500 years. I mean, this is a long time process. The things Isaiah wrote, the doctrines, the teachings, they teach are nothing but human rules, nothing but human commandments. They've made them way bigger than the reality of what they are, according to God. Matthew doesn't tell us that the Pharisees, the devoutly religious people, and the teachers of law, the teachers of the faith for them, he doesn't tell us they responded in any way. I think they're just so offended by this. How dare he talk to us like that, right? But Matthew remembers that Jesus calls the crowd that has obviously showed up now, because when you hear people having arguments, especially theological arguments, it's always kind of fun to go watch, right? To see how it's going to fall out. And they're kind of going at it, and there are people. Jesus, everybody, crowd, come in here. I want you to listen and understand what I'm saying, right? I want to be clear with you people so you aren't misunderstanding something, right? Because you may be thinking, I'm putting down the law, because that was one of the accusations they made about Jesus, that he was, here's the theological term, he was poo-pooing law. He was making it not that big of a deal, right? And Jesus is like, no. In fact, if you read much about Jesus, about the way that he was described, they say, no, he kept everything a law. He fulfilled the law by his life and by the way he lived. But because he pushed back on these extra traditions, this extra biblical stuff, there was this view that he was not that committed to it all. Jesus says, listen and understand what I'm saying, right? I want to be clear about this. It's not what goes into the mouth accidentally is the intention of what he says, right? It's not what goes into the mouth accidentally that makes them unclean. It's not the little bug that might accidentally have gotten there. It's not what pollutes or defiles the person, because that's what it was taught. It wasn't just making you unclean ceremonially. It was like gonna get inside of you and it's gonna make you unacceptable to God. It's not that. In fact, it's what comes out of their mouths that makes them unclean. It's what comes out of our mouth that pollutes or defiles the person. which I hope would make us stop and ask ourselves a deep theological question for a moment. And it's simply this. What if God is more concerned with who we are than the minutia? What if God is more concerned about who we are and how we are than about all the little details that sometimes people tell us are really, really important? What if that little gnat that somehow accidentally got in your mouth while you were sleeping isn't gonna, defile you, and pollute you, make you unclean before God? What if accidents happen sometimes? And it's not so much about trying to prevent every accident from happening, because when we get focused on all those little details, sometimes we forget the more important details, like the people that are sitting right around us. See, to be defiled was to be at odds with God. It made us unacceptable to God. And that's why they had, so many of the traditions, the elders were about these extra rules to try to keep what they would view as the more important rules. And in making all those extra little rules, then it became about, we had to keep making more rules to explain things, because people always have questions. Have you noticed that? If I say, you're not supposed to do this, we always try to figure out, especially if we want to do that, we kind of figure out a way around it, right? And we say things like, well, I didn't do what you said not to do. I did something else that was much like it, but not quite the same thing. See, what puts us at odds with God is what comes out of us, was clearly what Jesus is saying. But Matthew remembers that when he got done with the crowd, that Jesus kind of moves away, and the followers all kind of follow Jesus, and they get him alone, and they come to him, and they ask Jesus a question, right? And I love the question they asked him. Look at this question. Jesus, do you know that the Pharisees are angry? They're offended, they're shocked because of what you just said? Do you have a clue to that, Jesus, how offended they were? And Jesus is like, no, really? I had no idea that offended him, right? Of course he knew it, right? He's Jesus. And he was there when it happened. He said the words, which is interesting. He said words that we might say, what came out of him was not very nice. But Jesus knew sometimes when you care about someone, so many times when you love somebody, sometimes you have to speak the truth in a way that will put them on their heels, so that maybe they'll be caught off guard and maybe some of it will land. They're like, don't you know that, the Pharisees, these really important people, they were offended by you, shocked by how you would talk to them, right? They were angry. In fact, they left angry that you would describe them that way. To which Jesus does a very Jesus thing again. He doesn't really kind of respond to it. He's not like, yeah, I knew, guys. Of course I knew. He just says, listen, folks, every plant that my Father in heaven has not planted himself will be pulled up by the roots. Which is like, thank you, Jesus, for making that so clear. But I think it's, in other words, he's saying, listen, if this isn't from God, then it needs to get out of the way. And he was clearly trying to separate not only himself, but his followers from the impact and the influence that this tradition of the elders, this oral Torah that it had such a huge impact. In fact, it still has an impact today. It actually was finally written down, I think it was about in the year like 300, 400. It was actually, the oral Torah, I guess it got enough that they finally decided to write it down, and it comes to us in a couple different forms today. You can actually go read it. It's the Mishnah. Is one of them. Midrash. I think there's 3 different books of these pieces, right? But Jesus is like, every plant that my Father hasn't planted needs to be pulled up. And then he drops the bombshell. And he's speaking directly now to his followers, his closest followers, most likely just the 12 guys. He says to them, guys, stay away from the Pharisees. Leave them. Ignore them. Don't have anything to do with them. At one time, they were okay to have, but now they have gotten so far off track. Not only they got off track, they are misleading people. Here's how he puts it. They are blind guides, which is not the kind of guide you want to follow if you're trying to get someplace, right? And Jesus says, listen, this isn't rocket science, folks. A blind person who guides a blind person, both of them are going to fall in the ditch, right? They're going to get in trouble, because that's a recipe for disaster. If one can't see, he can't lead somebody who can't see to a good spot. So leave them alone. Stay away from them. Nothing they have will be of benefit to you. which we always remember that Peter was one of the 12. Peter was the guy that you always want to have around because he always asked the question all of us want to ask, but none of us really want to ask out loud, right? And Peter says to Jesus, Jesus, would you simply explain this parable to us? You know, it kind of went over our heads. And I think at this point, Jesus is not frustrated. He was frustrated at the Pharisees and the teachers of the law earlier. Now he is just, I think he smiles when he looks at Peter now. Because here's what he says to Peter. Do you still not understand? Literally, are you so dull, Peter? Knock, knock, knock. Anybody in there? Hey, come on, Peter. You know, you've been around me long enough. You should be picking this stuff up by now, right? Don't you know, Peter? Don't you know that all the food that enters the mouth goes into the stomach and then it goes out of the body, right? Into the sewer. Now, you'd be like, Mike, how can you talk about that? That's what Jesus said. Don't get mad at me. He's just describing a function that all of us know, probably experience at least a couple times a day, right? He's just describing sort of how this whole process works. You eat something, and after a while, it comes out. Don't you know that, he's saying? Don't you know that it's not the stuff that's going in, that's the bad stuff, right? Not being so worried about, accidentally eating something that you're not supposed to. But what people say with their mouths, what comes out of their mouth, comes from the heart. Comes from the way they think is another way to understand that. But it's not really necessarily a way we think. It's more like a thought process that's in our brains. It's sort of a bend of our hearts, this internal part of our lives that sort of at times pops up and we're like, that wasn't expected. Right? You kind of get in that moment. It's like, whoa, where did that come from? But what people say with their mouths comes from their heart. These are the things that make people unclean, that pollute, defile a person. Which is kind of funny if you think about it, because that's exactly what Jesus has said to the crowd. And Peter's like, Jesus, please explain this parable. And Jesus is like, okay, I'm gonna tell you the exact same thing I told the crowd, Peter. Hopefully this time you'll catch it, right? It's not the thing that accidentally goes into us that gets us in trouble, right? Because that'll come out on its own. It's the stuff that comes out this way. This end is the important end. The stuff that comes out this end. In fact, then Jesus goes into a little detail. Matthew remembers this. He writes it down. He says, Jesus said, for out of the heart, from out of the mind comes evil intentions, evil thoughts, evil ideas, right? And I'm guessing you at some moment have had, a thought that popped in your mind. You thought, where did that come from, right? That's just really weird. How would I even think about that kind of thing, right? I mean, did I watch some bad movie last night? What's gotten in there to, but those ideas pop up. Out of the heart comes murder. The idea of why we're murdering is the push of it all. Out of our hearts come adultery, sexual sins, stealing, lying, speaking evil of others, slander and blasphemy. These are the things that make people unclean. These are things that pollute us, that defile us. In fact, he goes on and says, listen, eating with unwashed hands does not make them unclean. It doesn't leave them polluted or defiled. And the reality is you don't have to be a religious person to understand how this works. Because all of us know there's something in us because we've experienced it, right? We've had those moments where we said, why did we say that? And we don't have an explanation of why we said that, but we know we said it because we heard it with our own ears, that we said that knuckleheaded thing. Or we might ask, where did that come from, right? Where is that coming from? Why? I've never even thought that before. How could that come out? How could we have done that? You ever ask yourself that question? How could I have done that, right? The answer is, well, you did it. I don't know how, but you kind of did it. Now, we might push back a little bit and say, well, sometimes we say things we don't mean, right? And maybe we do. But the reality is sometimes we also say things we don't mean to say out loud. Those embarrassing, despicable, relationship-ending, career-killing, financially debilitating behaviors. They all come from somewhere. And Jesus will say the somewhere they come from happens to be sitting exactly where you're sitting at this moment. Which is not a very comforting thing, right? It's in us. And here's maybe the saddest part about all that. The people closest to us live with what's in us every day. Because it pops out at different times. For some of us, we wait till we get home because we got to behave at jobs so we have a job when we get home, right? But we get home and it's like, it comes out. Or maybe just, something builds up and something out of the blue hits it and it pops. But the people close to us know what's in us because they live with it all the time. And the reality is, because we've all had those moments where we've said that stupid thing, where we've done that thing that we wish we could go back and take back. We've just messed stuff up, and at that moment, it's too late to fix it. Let me see if I can put this to us another way. I want you to imagine, you got your coffee cup, you're at work, you're walking down, you just got your coffee filled up, you're going back to your cubicle, your office, your station, wherever you work at. And as you walk along, somebody bumps you, right? Bumps you and out spills the coffee. And if I was to ask you, why did we spill our coffee? You would say, because they bumped me, right? I was being careful, they bumped me, that's what spilled me. But the reality is, we spilled coffee because we had coffee in our cup. If you had tea in that cup, you would have spilled tea, right? Water, same kind of thing. Here's the reality. Whatever's in our cup is what's going to spill out. Which ought to almost make us feel just a little uncomfortable, right? Because it's only going to come out if it's already there, right? But maybe to make it even a little bit worse, let me ask you another what if. What if we're responsible for what our cup is full of? Not a very comforting thing, right? That's why we're going to spend the next 4 weeks talking some more about, these emotions that try to sabotage, try to derail our lives. Because I think the question I hope we'll ask today and begin to try to answer over the next few weeks is simply this. Are we good with that? Are we good with the idea that we're responsible for it when sometimes we're not even clear what it is? Or could there maybe be another way to deal with it?